Good to see you again, my friend. Welcome. Join me in my study, where we may sit in comfort, and I can tell you the tale of the strange case of Langenhoe. An important candidate for one of Britain's most haunted buildings, the story of the now demolished Essex Church of St Mary's in the remote village of Langenhoe contains many and varied accounts of strange and inexplicable happenings. It remains one of the great hauntings of the 20th century. Essex is said to be one of England's most haunted shires, home to a host of ghostly tales, as well as stories of witchcraft and black magic. The birthplace of the notorious 17th century witchfinder general Matthew Hopkins, it is often referred to as the Witch County. Its haunted capital, as we have seen, is undeniably the tiny village of Borley. But 20 miles south, near the town of Colchester, lies another haunted site which many believe equals and even surpasses the incidents which are alleged to have occurred at Henry Bull's famous rectory. Curiously, both locations are connected, not only historically, but also in the nature of the paranormal phenomena reported. And although this haunting did not achieve the fame or notoriety of the most haunted house in England, it is a tale of ghosts, poltergeists, phantom women, and an evil which has plagued this Essex village, perhaps for centuries. For this is a forgotten ghost story, the strange case of Langenhoe. Langenhoe, Anglo-Saxon for Long Hill, is situated on rising ground above bleak marshland near Mersey Island. The village centre lies along the B1025, and today a turning off the main road down a long lane brings a curious traveller to the remains of a desolate graveyard hidden by tall trees. A few solitary headstones lean in the tall grass, and despite the proximity of several modern farm buildings, there is a loneliness to this remote spot. This is the site of Langenhoe Church, built in the 14th century, damaged by an earthquake in 1884, demolished in 1962, and believed by many to have once been the most haunted church in England. Early in 1937, the Reverend Ernest Merriweather was inducted as rector. Born in the north of England, he had never before encountered the paranormal, nor had any interest in the subject. Yet soon after his arrival, he began to experience strange incidents at his new church, occurrences that were to gain in frequency and intensity over the next 20-year period. Initially, these were seemingly insignificant episodes, such as the rector's valise, a small case for carrying his vestments and books, unaccountably locking itself when left in the vestry. Within the environs of the church and the churchyard, every effort to open the valise met with defeat, yet Merriweather found the case would open normally when he was in the lane away from the building. On the 20th of September 1937, a still autumn day with not a breath of wind, the rector was alone in the church. Without warning, the west door, which was standing open, slammed shut with an incredible crash that seemed to shake the entire building. These early odd incidents were recorded by the Reverend Merriweather in his diary, a practice he would continue up until his departure in 1959. Many of the entries describe typical poltergeist activity, such as the movement of objects within the church and the sound of thudding noises which were heard coming from the vestry, as if clods of earth were being thrown at the door. The rector was not the only experienced, as inexplicable incidents were witnessed on several occasions by members of the Langenhoe congregation. The phenomenon of ghostly music has been reported on many occasions and in numerous locations over the years by psychical researchers. See Melvin Williams' Music, Witchcraft and the Paranormal, published by Melrose Books in 2005. And Langenhoe is a case in point. On the 28th of September 1950, while in the vestry, the rector heard the voice of a young woman singing. The sound, which resembled plain song, seemed to emanate from the west end of the building. When the sound died away, Merryweather heard what he took to be heavy footsteps walking slowly up the aisle of the church. The rector quietly went through the vestry door, whereupon the footsteps ceased abruptly, and he found the nave empty. The same ghostly singing was heard again a week later, when the rector arrived at the church to find two workmen crouched by the west door, attempting to look in through the keyhole. The men beckoned to him to come forward, and as Merryweather approached, the sound of the singing could clearly be heard coming from the empty church. All three men then explored the building, even climbing the spiral staircase to the tower, but could find nothing. The church was deserted. Another oral feature of the Langenhoe haunting involves sinister whisperings and voices inside the church. Following an outbreak of hooliganism in the local area, where people had been assaulted by a number of youths, Ernest Merryweather took, rather dramatically, to carrying a dagger for his own protection. While alone at the church one day, he had placed a dagger firmly in a belt around his waist under his cassock. As he stood in front of the altar for a moment, he felt the knife being pulled from his belt, and, as it clattered to the floor, he heard a female voice say very clearly, "You are a cruel man." On another occasion, the rector arrived at the church, and as he walked into the vestry, heard voices coming from the direction of the chancel. 2 or 3 people seemed to be having a whispered conversation, with a male voice dominating, although no actual words could be distinguished. The talking ceased after a few minutes, to be followed by a deep, sorrowful sigh. The rector immediately went into the church, but as with the incidents experienced previously with the 2 workmen, the building was empty. The Reverend Merryweather's diary contains other similar entries of hearing other sounds and voices in the church, as well as unexplained footsteps in the churchyard outside. As with the haunting of Borley Rectory, apparitions and phantom figures also feature in the Langenhoe story. On Christmas Eve 1950, as Ernest Merryweather was walking up the nave towards the chancel, a curious vague form seemed to suddenly appear from nowhere, glide across the nave in front of him, and disappear into the pulpit. Merryweather described the figure as possibly that of a man dressed in a tweed suit. On separate occasions during Sunday services, as the rector stood by the altar officiating, he saw the figure of a woman in what appeared to be late medieval or Tudor dress cross the west end of the church and vanish into the stone wall. On another occasion, while practicing at the organ in the empty church, the rector felt as though he was being watched from behind. Turning from his seat, he saw a woman wearing a modern cream dress looking intently at him. The experience was fleeting, and almost instantly Merryweather realised that the person had gone. Perhaps the most extraordinary incident of the entire Langenhoe haunting occurred not in the church, but in the nearby Langenhoe Hall. One day in the autumn of 1947, the Reverend Merryweather was being shown around the house by its then owner, Mrs. Cummings. On reaching a particular room, the rector commented on the pleasant view it commanded over the surrounding marshland. His host, however, did not care for the room, saying that she felt there was an unusual atmosphere, which at times she found unpleasant. After Mrs. Cummings had left the room, Merryweather lingered for one last look from the window before turning to follow her. As he did so, he had the impression of walking straight into the unmistakable and frantic embrace of a naked, invisible woman. The rector reported that the phenomena lasted only seconds, but was emphatic that it was not his imagination. Such was the rector's concern for what was taking place at Langenhoe, he ultimately sought the advice of his superior, the Bishop of Colchester. Rather than being dismissive, the bishop lent a sympathetic ear to the rector's plight, as he himself had experienced apparent poltergeist phenomena several years previously during the Foyster incumbency of Borley Rectory. While visiting the house during the height of the disturbances, a stone had been thrown at him which narrowly missed his head before smashing into a fireplace. Although Merryweather had not up to that time undertaken any research into the history of Langenhoe, he was later to learn that villagers had for many years considered the immediate area around the church as being haunted. Local legends tell of a lady in black who walks around the churchyard at night. There is an account of two sisters who, in 1908, reported seeing the figure of a woman dressed in old-fashioned nun-like clothing, which moved slowly along the pathway between the gravestones before disappearing into the north wall of the church. Merryweather was also to discover that Langenhoe and Borley were historically connected. In 1583, Nicholas Waldegrave, Lord of the Manor of Borley and son of Sir Edward Waldegrave, acquired the manor of Langenhoe on his marriage to Catherine Brown, who, with her sister Jane, had inherited the Langenhoe estate in the same year. The Waldegraves, as patrons of the living, would have been responsible for the appointment of the rectors of Langenhoe, as well as those of Borley. During the 17th century, their chosen clergymen officiated at both churches, an arrangement which seemed to have continued into the early 1700s, with the livings of Borley and Langenhoe being combined in 1661, 1680, and again in 1758. Not only are there historical connections between the two villages, but also a curious mirror-like symmetry of supernatural happenings. At Langenhoe, the majority of paranormal activity took place in the old church, while the rectory, apart from Merryweather's astonishing ghostly embrace, played little part in the haunting. At Borley, although the church had its own haunted history, much of which dates from the end of the Second World War, the rectory was a main focus during the most haunted house's heyday of the Ball family and later the Smiths and the Foysters. Beginning in the late 1940s, veteran British ghost hunter Peter Underwood took an interest in the case, and the first account of the story appeared in his 1974 book, A Host of Hauntings. In September 1949, together with the Reverend John Denning, he carried out an all-night vigil at Langenhoe Church, during which a violent thunderstorm obliterated any aural phenomena that might have occurred within the much-haunted building. Further investigation held the following year again yielded negative results. In 1958, several seances were held at Langenhoe Church in an attempt to establish a cause for the haunting. The communicating entities allegedly contacted included a tyrannical Sir Robert Atford, the Lord of the Manor during the reign of King James I, who had supposedly murdered his serving girl lover Mary Felicity in the church in the early 1600s. A similar tale tells of a past rector who had also done away with his illicit sweetheart within the precinct of St. Mary's, and there are other allegations of murderous violence. One of the lords of the manor in the 14th century was Lionel de Bradenham, a lawless man who was in the pay of the Borley Waldegraves and who allegedly committed several murders. Underwood, however, was disinclined to accept the seance evidence as providing a truthful explanation of the haunting, and from scant records of the life of de Bradenham, there is certainly no historical evidence that anyone was actually murdered inside Langenhoe Church. Also, it should be noted that in many hauntings, local legends and traditions are often moulded to fit and substantiate particular aspects of the reported phenomena. Is there possibly a more sinister reason for the strange phenomena which has been experienced at Langenhoe over the years? Tragedy and death seem to haunt this lonely village as much as the restless spirits who once walked to the environs of its lost church. And is there an ancient curse or hex, the origins of which are now lost in the mists of time, that give evil a free rein? 400-year-old Langenhoe Hall in particular has seen its fair share of disaster. 3 people have committed suicide within its walls, one of whom is believed to have been a member of the Waldegrave family. In the 19th century, 9 children of the then owner of the hall all died in infancy, their mother passing away shortly after the last child. Albert Lowenstein, the Belgian financier who owned the estate during the First World War, committed suicide by jumping out of a plane over the English Channel. The estate was then bought by a man who failed to make a success of his investment and drowned himself in a sluice pipe by Adder Marsh. Soon after the First World War, a driven herd of horses awaiting transportation to the continent were panicked when a terrific snowstorm struck Langenhoe. The resulting chaos caused the deaths of many of the drovers. Since then, many suicides have been reported at the spot where the herdsmen died. Langenhoe Rectory has also had its share of misfortune. Over the years, it has witnessed a number of serious and strange accidents, and also the suicide of a previous owner. Further tragic episodes continued into the 1940s when a young man accidentally shot and killed his fiancée in a cottage in the village, and 2 years before the church was demolished, 72-year-old Edward May died while cutting down the undergrowth of the churchyard. Clearly, a legacy of doom has hung over this lonely village for many years. Yet whether this series of unfortunate events has any bearings on the reasons for the haunting, we can only speculate. Whatever the origins of the strange phenomena at Langenhoe, there are many people who accept that a number of the paranormal incidents reported there were indeed genuine. It is possible to attribute at least some of the auditory phenomena, knocks, bangs, creaks and taps in the church, to the fragile condition of the building's fabric. Following the Essex earthquake of 1884, the church was never structurally sound, and even after restoration the walls and floors remained out of true alignment. However, not all of the reported activity can be explained in this way, and the incidents of footsteps, voices, spectral singing, as well as the sighting of apparitions, must be given special consideration. Although many people experience the curious happenings at Langenhoe, the principal witness to the phenomenon was the Reverend Merriweather. His diary entries chronicling the events span a period of 22 years and record almost every aspect of the reported paranormal episodes. It is his testimony which carries much of the argument for supernatural phenomena in this remote and lonely spot. Peter Underwood described him as a shrewd man who would not be easily fooled or carried away by his imagination, was as puzzled, critical and sceptical of the events he experienced during his incumbency as anyone else. In short, a good witness. Although the rector claimed not to have experienced similar happenings prior to his arrival in Essex, it seems most probable that he was unknowingly psychic, perhaps confusing or masking this fact as part of his innate spiritual nature and vocation within the Church of England, and that his arrival at Langenhoe acted as a catalyst for phenomena to occur. If there is any truth to the stone tape theory, that physical surroundings can absorb an impression of violent and tragic events, and later, under a combination of circumstances or conditions, and with the right person present, can play back these recordings in the form of paranormal noises and apparitions, one would certainly expect it to apply to Langenhoe. Perhaps the church itself, which had stood through all of the troubled times of the surrounding area, acted as a focal point, absorbing and later allowing impressions of these happenings to return again in some unknown way. In 1959, Ernest Merriweather retired from the ministry when Langenhoe was combined with the neighbouring parish of Abberton. St Mary's became redundant and, after the furnishings and fittings were removed, the doors were locked and the church was abandoned to rats, mice, and perhaps its host of lost and indigenous phantoms. In 1962 it was demolished, its disused graveyard, now consumed by weeds and nettles, being the only reminder of former times. The Reverend Merriweather died in 1965, by which time the strange events which had taken place at this lonely village on the marshes over the previous 2 decades had all but faded from living memory. During research for a book, paranormal investigator and author Eddie Brazil, accompanied by his wife, paid a visit to Langenhoe and was fortunate to meet Stephen Wormel, the current owner of Langenhoe Hall. Mr. Wormel, who has lived in Hall all his life, and in particular as a child, can remember the demolition of St Mary's in the early 1960s. Although he had not experienced anything out of the ordinary, he confirmed that the upstairs room in the hall in which the Reverend Merriweather had his strange encounter with a naked apparition, even though it faces south, is always cold, and like a previous owner of the hall, Mrs. Cummings, he did not care for the room or its atmosphere. During a tour of the grounds, Mr. Wormald pointed out the room and said he would like to have shown the visitors inside, but his son was at that moment in bed asleep. Looking up at the drawn curtains, Mr. and Mrs. Brazil both reflected that within that room seemingly occurred one of the most bizarre incidents in the entire history of paranormal phenomena. A short time later, Brazil and his wife made their way over to the now abandoned and empty churchyard. Among the leaning and eroded gravestones, both were conscious of experiencing a strange physical sensation, as if some force was sapping their energy. Mrs. Brazil felt this unpleasant sensation more than her husband, and, quickly becoming nauseous, had to return to the car. Before joining her, Brazil took a series of photographs, acutely aware that he was standing on the site of one of the allegedly most haunted buildings in the country, the exact location where inexplicable footfalls, apparitions, and unknown singing had been experienced, and where, in June 1951, while working alone in this very churchyard, the Reverend Merriweather had the feeling of being watched by a legion of unseen figures. As the researcher and his wife drove away down the main road, it began to rain, and the strange story of Langenhoe seemed suddenly far away, although both sensed that within its abandoned graveyard, something else and far more unsettling still remains. And so ends my telling of the strange case of Langenhoe. I hope you found it entertaining. If you did, please subscribe, like, and maybe leave a comment down below. It's been a pleasure to sit with you again, my friend, and I look forward to speaking with you again very soon.